The blizzard tore across the Nebraska prairie with murderous intent, transforming the landscape into a frozen hell, where visibility ended 3 feet from a man's face. Snow fell in suffocating waves that buried fence posts and obliterated trails, while wind screamed with a voice that sounded almost human in its fury. The temperature had plummeted so far below zero that exposed skin froze in seconds and breath crystallized before it could leave a man's lungs. Matto fought through the white chaos, each step a victory against death itself. His shoulder burned with agony, where the bullet had torn through muscle 2 days earlier, and blood had long since soaked through the makeshift bandage, freezing into a stiff crust against his buckskin coat. His fingers wrapped around the leather satchel pressed to his chest had gone numb hours ago. He could no longer feel his feet inside his moccasins, and his vision kept blurring at the edges, dark spots dancing like crows circling carrion. But he pushed forward. Left foot, right foot, again, again. Because the alternative was dying here, in this godless storm with the truth still buried. And that would mean Ayanna's death meant nothing. Kimimela's death meant nothing. The suffering of his people scattered like seeds on barren ground would remain unanswered. The memories came unbidden sharp as the wind cutting his face. Ayanna laughing as she taught their daughter to weave grass into small baskets, her hands moving with practiced grace. Kimimela's face lighting up when she caught her first grasshopper, cupping it gently before releasing it back into the summer meadow. "Everything deserves to live, Papa," she had said with the profound wisdom of children. Even little things. That summer felt like another lifetime. Another world where the Platte River ran clear and buffalo still grazed the grasslands, and the future seemed as endless as the prairie sky. Before the men with papers came, before the militia raid that autumn morning in 1879, when armed riders surrounded their encampment and a man wearing a sheriff's star with a broken clasp on rawhide struck Chief Greyhawk with a rifle butt for daring to ask questions. Matto had been hunting when the raid happened, tracking elk in the hills with 2 other men. They had returned to find their lodges burning belongings, scattered families being herded like animals toward waiting wagons. He had searched frantically for Ayanna, and Kimimela found them huddled with other women and children, terrified but unharmed. At least physically. The forced march to reservation land had taken 3 days. 3 days of walking through early snow with inadequate supplies, while soldiers kept rifles trained on anyone who slowed. The elderly struggled. The children cried. Ayanna had carried Kimimela on her back for miles when the little girl's legs gave out, refusing Matto's offers to take the burden because she knew his hands were needed to help the elders. The reservation land was a cruel joke, alkali soil that poisoned crops' water sources miles away, and often contaminated no timber for building proper shelters. They had spent that first winter in hastily constructed brush shelters that leaked and let in the cold. Government rations arrived sporadically, always less than promised, often spoiled. Disease spread quickly through the crowded, unsanitary conditions. When the fever came in January, it swept through like wildfire. Kimimela fell sick first, her small body burning with heat that no remedy could touch. Ayanna nursed her day and night, singing the old songs, telling stories, refusing to sleep or eat. "She needs me," Ayanna had insisted when Matto tried to make her rest. "I can't abandon her. No." Kimimela died on a Tuesday morning, her last word a whispered "Papa" that still echoed in Matto's dreams. Ayanna had washed her daughter's body with tender care, dressed her in the beaded dress she had been making for the spring festival that would never come, and then collapsed herself as the fever claimed her too. She lasted 3 more days, fighting with the same fierce determination she brought to everything. But in the end, her body simply gave out. "Promise me," she had whispered with her last breath, gripping Matto's hand with surprising strength. Don't let grief turn you into something cruel. Seek justice, not revenge. Make them see the truth. Honor us that way. He had promised. And for 2 years that promise had driven him through impossible conditions and deadly situations, following leads and gathering evidence, building a case against the men who had orchestrated the theft of his people's land and the suffering that followed. Now that evidence was pressed against his chest in a waterproof satchel, and his destination was finally visible through the storm, a dark shape with squared edges that meant human construction. The relay station. Matto hit the door with his good shoulder. Once, twice. On the third impact, wood splintered and the latch gave way. He tumbled inside, hitting the floor hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. Fresh blood seeped through his bandage. The sudden warmth of the cabin, barely above freezing but 50 degrees warmer than outside, made his frozen skin scream with returning sensation. He looked up and saw her. The woman stood against the far wall, telegraph equipment behind her, a butcher's knife gripped in her right hand. She wore a dark wool dress with a torn shoulder seam that exposed skin marked by old bruises shaped like fingerprints. Her hair, dark brown shot with auburn, had come loose from its pins, but it was her eyes that held him pale blue-gray cold as winter ice, assessing him without panic or fear. For a moment, neither moved. Wind rattled the window. The stove crackled weakly, nearly out of fuel. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, or perhaps that was just the storm's voice. Matto raised his left hand, slowly palm open. "Blind Otis," he rasped through frozen lips. "Drop point." The woman's gaze flicked to his bleeding shoulder, then to his face. "You're bleeding all over my floor. Better than freezing on your porch." He worked the satchel's buckle loose with numb fingers and spilled its contents, deeds, affidavits, telegrams, receipts onto the boards between them. Her eyes widened fractionally before control reasserted itself. "Those are stolen. Stolen back. From men who stole land, lives, futures." His voice was hard as flint. "From men who drove my people off the Platte River at gunpoint and left them to die on reservation land that won't grow food." Her jaw tightened. She glanced at the window where snow was piling against the glass. "You picked a bad night to break into a sheriff's cabin." Cold dread settled in Matto's gut. "The sheriff here, stranded at the courthouse, 3 miles south. He won't make it back tonight, maybe not tomorrow if this storm holds." She studied him carefully. "You, his deputy. His wife." The words hit like a fist. Matto had imagined many possibilities for Blind Otis's identity. A sympathetic clerk, a disgruntled soldier, a homesteader with access to the wires. Never the sheriff's own wife. She seemed to read his shock. "I'm not my husband." The distinction hung between them, fragile and crucial. Matto wanted to believe it, needed to believe it, because his evidence was worthless without someone to verify and decode it. "You know ciphers. You run this station. You see everything that moves through this territory." She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze moved from the papers to his bleeding shoulder, to the door hanging ajar, letting in gusts of snow. Finally, she crossed the room, slammed the door shut, and wedged a broom handle under the latch. "I know ciphers," she admitted quietly. "And I know what happens to people who cross men like Silas Beck and my husband. If you bleed out on my floor, those papers are worthless. If you live long enough to talk, we both might hang." She met his eyes directly. "So, before I decide whether to help or throw you back into that storm, what exactly do you want from me?" Matto held her gaze, searching for deception. He found only exhaustion and barely contained anger. "Justice. I want the men who drove my people off our land to answer for it. Judge Cutler arrives in 3 days for circuit court. I need to make sure he sees this evidence. Something flickered in her ice-colored eyes, hope perhaps, or recognition. She studied him a moment longer, then made her decision. She set the knife on the table and pulled off her torn shawl. I'm Hazel Reinhardt. And yes, God help me, I'm blind Otis. Relief and wariness warred in Mado's chest. Mado. Lakota. From the North Bend to the Platte before your husband decided we shouldn't be there anymore. Recognition sharpened her features. The raids 2 years ago. Autumn of '79. Multiple families displaced. My kin. My wife Ayana and daughter Kimimela, they died 3 months after the relocation. Fever from exposure and malnutrition on reservation land with bad water and no shelter. His voice remained flat, but rage simmered beneath. Because of papers signed by your husband giving our land to Beck's cattle syndicate. Hazel's shoulders tensed, but she didn't defend or deny. Instead, she crossed to a trunk under the bed and pulled out medical supplies, thread needles, whiskey-clean linen. Take off your coat. I'll stitch that shoulder before you lose more blood. Then we'll see if your papers are worth dying for. Mado hesitated only briefly before shrugging out of his frozen coat. His buckskin shirt was soaked with blood. He peeled it away from the wound, a ragged furrow where the bullet had torn through muscle, and fresh blood welled immediately. Hazel knelt beside him, needle already threaded. She didn't flinch at the torn flesh. Without warning, she poured whiskey directly into the wound. Mado's entire body went rigid, jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. The alcohol burned like liquid fire, searing every nerve ending. White light exploded behind his eyes, but he forced himself to remain still. You're lucky, Hazel said quietly as she began stitching with practiced efficiency. Another inch right, and this would have severed the artery. You'd have bled out alone. Luck had nothing to do with it, Mado replied through gritted teeth. The man who shot me had bad aim. I made sure he won't improve it. Something that might have been dark humor flickered in her eyes. I assume he's not coming after you. No. He's feeding crows in a canyon 30 miles north. She nodded, accepting this without judgment, and continued stitching. Each puncture of the needle was precise, drawing the wound's edges together with neat, even stitches. Mado focused on breathing in for 3 counts, out for 3, watching her work. You've done this before, he observed. Out here you learn fast or die. Dr. Whitlow showed me basics when I arrived. Said a woman this far from town needed emergency skills. Bitterness edged her voice. He was more right than he knew. How long have you been here? Year and 2 months. Arrived from Chicago in March of 1880 with nothing but a trunk and a warrant for my arrest. She tied off the final stitch and sat back. Married Klaus 3 weeks later because I had no other options, or thought I didn't. Chicago. A warrant, a hasty marriage. Pieces of a larger picture, but crucial parts remained missing. Before Mado could ask more, she wiped blood from her hands and gestured to his frozen coat. Leave that. It's rigid as a board. You'll reopen those stitches trying to move in it. She retrieved a woolen shirt from a peg and handed it to him. He pulled it on gratefully, the dry warmth against his skin feeling like luxury. He settled near the stove while Hazel fed another log into the firebox, coaxing weak flames higher. Then she turned to the scattered papers, gathering them with careful respect. She spread them on the table in organized rows, telegrams by date, deeds by property, affidavits by witness, and adjusted the lamp for better light. Start with the telegram, Mado said, pointing to the coated yellow slip. That led me here. Someone intercepted it 3 weeks ago and passed it through displaced homesteader networks. It mentions this station as a drop point and refers to Blind Otis. Hazel picked up the telegram, studying the seemingly random letters and numbers. Substitution cipher. Multiple layers. Deliberately obfuscated. She pulled out a notebook half filled with cipher keys, evidence of months of secret work. But not unbreakable. What's the context? Platte River land deeds from autumn '79 to present. Look for Klaus Reinhardt, Silas Beck, Deputy Rourke, and anything about militia payments, wagons, gun supplies. Hazel's jaw tightened, but she nodded and began working through the code with focused intensity pencil, moving in quick strokes as she tested substitutions and built the decryption key. While she worked, Maddow picked up an affidavit and read aloud Dr. Whitlow's testimony describing the raid, the injuries the leader with a broken star on Rawhide who struck Chief Greyhawk. His voice roughened as he read about the 3 injured elders and 2 hurt children. "Your husband wears his star on Rawhide," Maddow said quietly, with a broken clasp. 3 witnesses have described it. Distinctive, unmistakable. Hazel's pencil paused. "He claims it's from a fight. Says he wears it as a badge of honor. A fight he started against unarmed families. Women, children, elders. He struck a grandfather with a rifle butt for asking questions." Maddow's voice turned cold as winter stone. "My wife and daughter died because we were forced onto land that couldn't sustain life. That's what his badge of honor represents." Hazel set down her pencil carefully and finally looked at him. For the first time, genuine emotion broke through her controlled mask, grief, guilt, and cold anger. "I didn't know. Not until months after I arrived, after I'd married him, and realized what kind of man I'd bound myself to. By then, I was trapped legally, financially, with a warrant he could activate with 1 telegram." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "But I started copying dispatches, sending warnings, trying to undo even a fraction of what he and Beck were doing." "Why?" Maddow asked bluntly. "Why risk yourself for strangers?" She was silent for a long moment. "Because I know what it's like to be powerless, to have everything taken by men who weaponize the law, to watch injustice and have everyone look away because it's easier." Her voice strengthened with quiet fury. "I refuse to be complicit, even if it costs me everything. Because if I stay silent, I'm just as guilty as the men pulling triggers and forging papers." Maddow studied her face, searching for lies. He found only exhaustion and grim determination that mirrored his own. Slowly, he nodded. "Then we work together. We decode these documents, organize the evidence, and make sure Judge Cutler sees it all." Hope flickered in Hazel's eyes. "The judge is really coming. Circuit Court, 3 days, maybe 4 if the storm delays the train. That's our window." He leaned forward slightly. "Cutler has a reputation for being honest, one of the few officials Beck can't buy. If we can get him to see this evidence, he has power to issue warrants, freeze assets, order investigations." Determination hardened Hazel's features. She picked up her pencil again. "Then we'd better work fast, because if Klaus suspects what I'm doing, neither of us will live to see that judge." Outside, wind shrieked and wolves sang their hunting songs. Inside, 2 strangers began building a case that could bring down corrupt men and perhaps deliver long-denied justice. They worked through the night. Hazel decoded telegrams with remarkable speed, revealing messages about land assignments, militia payments, and planned evictions. Maddow cross-referenced deeds with his knowledge of the territory, mapping a pattern of systematic theft surrounding the coal seams near Red Oak Mine. Hours passed. The lamp burned low. Hazel's handwriting grew smaller as she filled pages with decoded messages. Maddow organized affidavits chronologically, building a timeline of corruption. As false dawn approached, though the storm made it impossible to see any lightning, Hazel set down her pencil and stretched. We have enough. 3 decoded telegrams confirming conspiracy's 7 forged deeds, with obvious discrepancies, 2 credible witness statements, and the receipt linking Klaus directly to militia raids. She looked at the papers spread before them. It's not perfect, but it's damning. If we can get it to Cutler, Maddow said. If. Hazel agreed, glancing at the window where snow had climbed halfway up the glass. This storm needs to break. A sound cut her off, low guttural scratching at the door. Not random debris scraping wood, but deliberate, persistent scratching, accompanied by wet snuffling. Maddow was on his feet, instantly ignoring the sharp pull of stitches. He pressed his ear to the door. The scratching stopped and then resumed with more force. Heavy bodies moving outside paws, crunching through snow, harsh breathing. Wolves, he said quietly. Hazel grabbed her knife. How many? At least 2. Maybe more. He could hear them circling, desperate and hungry, driven down from the hills by the storm. The doors shuddered under sudden impact, a heavy body throwing itself against the wood. The broom handle held barely. Maddow looked around, assessing options. The window was too small to escape through, and the walls were solid logs. They were trapped. Fire, Hazel said suddenly. She grabbed a burning log with iron tongs and positioned herself near the door. Wolves fear fire. Maddow drew his revolver, only 3 rounds left. He realized with grim awareness and nodded. Open it, just a crack. Hazel set the burning log on the floor and used the tongs to slide it toward the threshold. With her free hand, she gripped the latch, took a steadying breath, and yanked the door open 3 inches. Wolves lunged immediately. Yellow eyes reflected firelight. Bared fangs dripped saliva. A gray snout pushed through the opening jaws, snapping inches from Hazel's face. She shoved the burning log forward with the tongs. The tip caught the lead wolf's nose. It yelped a high-pained sound and recoiled, pawing at its singed fur. The other wolves fell back, circling just beyond the firelight's reach, growling low and dangerous. Maddow slammed the door shut and jammed the broom handle back into place, then wedged a chair under the handle for extra security. Outside, the wolves paced and snarled, but didn't attack again. The smell of singed fur lingered acrid in the air. Hazel retrieved the log, her hands shaking now that immediate danger had passed. She returned it to the stove and fed in more wood. That won't keep them away forever. If the fire dies, they'll be back, and next time we might not be so lucky. Maddow looked at the dwindling woodpile, maybe 6 hours of fuel if conservative. Then his gaze moved to the bed. He crossed to it, gripped the footboard, and with a sharp twist snapped off a corner post. The dry wood broke easily. He fed pieces into the stove, and flames roared back to life. Hazel stared. That's my bed. Would you rather sleep or live? She opened her mouth to argue, saw the logic, and closed it. After a moment, she grabbed the fire poker and began breaking off another post. Point taken. They worked in grim silence, dismantling the bed frame piece by piece. The heat intensified, and eventually the wolves gave up their howls, fading into the storm. But the reprieve felt temporary, earned at the cost of comfort. As the last piece burned, Hazel sank to the floor near the stove, exhaustion clear in every line of her body. Maddow lowered himself across from her shoulder, throbbing. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Hazel pulled a small flask from her pocket, took a sip that made her wince, and handed it to Maddow. He tasted harsh whiskey and handed it back. Survival whiskey, Hazel said with a ghost of dark humor. Different from medicinal whiskey. Despite everything, Maddow's mouth twitched. Smart. Smart enough to know we're in terrible trouble. The humor faded. Wolves outside. Klaus due back once the storm breaks. Judge delayed. Us sitting on evidence that could hang half the county. I've been in worse situations, Matto said. Name one. Winter of '79, chased by cavalry for 3 days. No food, no fire. Lost 2 fingers to frostbite. He held up his left hand, showing where the last 2 fingers ended at the second knuckle. Hazel looked at his scarred hand and then his face. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm still here. That's what matters. He paused. My wife used to say survival is its own victory, even when it doesn't feel like one. Hazel studied him in the firelight, weathered features marked by hardship and loss, but also by stubborn will. You loved her very much, very. More than breath. She was my balance. His voice roughened. When she died, I felt like I was falling through ice with no bottom. The only thing that kept me from drowning was the promise I made at her grave, that her death would mean something. Understanding softened Hazel's expression. I know what it's like to have everything taken. Not the same kind of loss, but... She trailed off, then continued quietly. I understand drowning. What happened in Chicago? Hazel hesitated, old habits of secrecy warring with new impulse toward honesty. Finally, she spoke, voice low. I was a telegraph operator for Western Union, skilled with ciphers, fast, accurate. Then money went missing from company accounts. When auditors came, all evidence pointed to me, altered books, forged signatures, prepared witnesses. It was perfect. Too perfect. Bitterness crept into her tone. I realized I'd been framed, but couldn't prove innocence. So I ran before trial, ended up here, desperate and alone. Klaus offered marriage protection, a fresh start. She laughed without humor. I thought I was lucky, thought I'd found a way to survive. But he was part of it. Matto said, understanding dawning. I didn't know that then. Only learned the truth tonight from the decoded telegrams. She pulled out her notebook and flipped to a page near the back. This came through 6 months ago. I copied it routinely, didn't think much of it. But when I decoded it tonight, she handed him the notebook. Matto read the decoded message, jaw tightening. Package delivered. Subject married and positioned at relay station. Access to territorial communications confirmed. Monitoring operational. Recommend continued leverage via original Chicago charges. Payment upon completion. Signed, AR. He looked up at Hazel, seeing pain and fury in her eyes. AR. Albert Rosen, my former supervisor at Western Union. The man who trained me, mentored me, recommended me for promotion. Her voice was flat with betrayal's weight. He framed me, on Beck's orders, to drive me west, force me into a position where I'd be useful to their conspiracy. The embezzlement of the evidence, the warrant, all manufactured to put me exactly where they needed me. The pieces fell into brutal place. They needed someone at the relay station, someone with cipher skills, someone they could control through fear of arrest. Someone who would marry the local sheriff without questions, because what choice did I have? Hazel's hands clenched. Klaus didn't marry me out of affection. He married me because Beck ordered it, because I was a useful tool they could manipulate. Anger kindled hot in Matto's chest, not just at the land theft and raids, but at the casual cruelty of weaponizing someone's desperation. You've been sabotaging them, as blind Otis. That's why you've survived. You made yourself valuable a different way. I've been trying, Hazel said, her voice cracking, trying to undo what they're doing, save people. But if they've been monitoring me... Fear entered her eyes. Then I've led them to everyone I was trying to help. Every homesteader who got my warnings, every family who fought back. I've been leading good people to slaughter while thinking I was saving them. Maddo reached out and gripped her shoulder, forcing her to meet his eyes. His hand was warm through the fabric grounding. You couldn't have known. You were doing the best you could, and your work brought me here with evidence they didn't expect. That counts. Does it? Her voice was raw. Where's the difference between me and Jonas Pike selling wagons he knew would be used for raids? Intent, Maddo said firmly. Pike knew those wagons were going to militia, even if he didn't know specifics. You had no idea about monitoring. Right now, what matters is what we do next. We have proof. We're going to make sure Cutler sees it. Hazel took a shaky breath and nodded slowly. You're right. We finish this. For your family. For everyone they've hurt. Together, Maddo said, and it was a promise. Together, Hazel echoed. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Something shifted in the air. The attraction had been present from the beginning in the way their eyes met and held, in the careful awareness of each other's movements. But now it deepened into something more substantial. Trust earned through crisis. Maddo released her shoulder, but the warmth of contact lingered. Hazel looked at where he had touched her, then back at his face. For a moment, neither spoke. The tension between them. Palpable, but not uncomfortable. More like a promise of something that might grow if they survived. We should rest, Hazel said finally. Take turns keeping the fire going. We'll need our strength. Maddo nodded. You first, I'll watch. Hazel hesitated, then pulled her cloak around herself and settled against the wall, closing her eyes. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed her. Maddo watched her for a moment, this sharp-edged, stubborn woman who risked everything for what was right, and felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Not quite hope, not yet. But the possibility of it. He fed another piece of wood into the stove, checked the barricaded door, and settled in for his watch. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside, two people rested in the fragile warmth of newfound alliance, gathering strength for battles still to come. Morning arrived, not with light, but with a subtle shift in the storm's character. The wind's pitch changed from shriek to moan, and the snow fell in slightly lighter curtains. Maddo woke first stiff and sore his shoulder, a knot of fire. He had slept sitting up, revolver in lap, old habits from years of running. Hazel stirred, blinked awake, and immediately looked at the stove. We're out of wood again. Maddo glanced at the empty space. They had burned the last bed frame pieces an hour before dawn. The stove held coals, but without fuel, they would die within the hour. The shed, Maddo said, pushing himself carefully to his feet. Hazel stood wrapping her cloak. 20 yards west. But in this storm, we make it 20 yards or we freeze. He scanned the cabin, spotted the coiled clothesline hanging near the door, and tested its strength. It would hold barely. I'll go, Hazel said. I know where the shed is. Maddo's instinct was to argue, but logic won. She knew the terrain, he didn't, and wasting time in argument could kill them both. 5 minutes. If you're not back, I pull you in. She tied one end of the rope to the door handle, the other around her waist, then pulled on her cloak and scarf. She looked at Maddo, eyes fierce above the fabric. Don't let go of that rope. I won't. She yanked open the door. The storm hit her like a physical blow, driving her back a step. Maddo braced against the doorframe, gripping the rope. Hazel leaned into the wind and pushed forward, disappearing into white within seconds. The rope went taut. Maddo fed it out slowly, feeling the pull and resistance as Hazel fought through drifts. 5 feet, 10, 15. He counted seconds. 60, 90, 120. At 2 minutes, the rope jerked hard. Once, twice, 3 times the signal for trouble. Maddo didn't hesitate. He tied his end around his waist and plunged into the storm. The cold was instant and absolute, stealing breath and vision. He followed the rope hand over hand, stumbling through waist-deep drifts. The wind tried to shove him sideways, but he planted his feet and pushed forward, ignoring the screaming pain in his shoulder. 10 yards out, he found her. Hazel had fallen into a collapsed drift, trapped waist-deep in powder that gave no purchase. She was struggling to pull herself out, but the snow kept caving in, threatening to bury her. Mato grabbed her arm and hauled upward. She kicked against the snow, scrabbling for footing. Together, they dragged her free, both gasping. Hazel pointed right the shed, barely visible through swirling white. They stumbled toward it, still roped together. A gust hit them broadside. Mato's feet went out from under him. He hit the ground hard, jarring his shoulder. Pain exploded white-hot, and he felt stitches tear. Hazel grabbed his coat and pulled him upright, her strength surprising. They reached the shed. The door was half buried. Mato kicked at the drift-clearing space and yanked the door open. Inside, the air was still and bitterly cold, but mercifully out of the wind. Hazel leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Mato bent over, hands on knees, feeling wetness spread across his shoulder where stitches had given way. That's when he heard it, a low growl from the shadows. He froze. Hazel heard it too, her eyes widening. A wolf stepped out from behind the woodpile, lean gray eyes like yellow glass. Its lips pulled back, revealing teeth. Another growl, and a second wolf appeared. Then a third. They had sheltered here, and now their sanctuary was threatened. The lead wolf tensed muscles, coiling. Hazel grabbed a piece of firewood and swung hard, catching the wolf across the snout. It yelped and fell back, shaking its head. The other two lunged. Mato kicked the first boot, connecting with ribs. It tumbled sideways, snarling. The second went for Hazel, jaws snapping. She brought the firewood down on its skull with a sickening crack. The wolf crumpled, stunned. The lead wolf recovered and circled, growling deep in its chest. Mato drew his revolver down to 2 rounds now and cocked the hammer. The metallic click was sharp and final in the enclosed space. The wolf's ears flattened. It held Mato's gaze for a long moment, weighing threat against hunger. Then it turned and bolted through the open door, the other two following into the storm. Mato and Hazel stood in sudden silence, breathing hard. "Grab the wood," Mato said. "Fast." They loaded their arms with split logs and stumbled back into the storm. The rope guided them, a thin lifeline in chaos. They fought their way back, step by step, until the cabin's door appeared. Mato shoved it open with his shoulder, and they fell inside, dropping wood in a heap. Hazel kicked the door shut and collapsed against it. Mato fed logs into the stove, coaxing coals back to life. Flames caught and roared. Heat spread through the cabin like a blessing. For several minutes, neither spoke. They simply sat, absorbing warmth, letting adrenaline drain. Mato's shoulder burned, and he knew several stitches had torn. Blood seeped through the borrowed shirt. Hazel's hands were raw and blistered from gripping rough wood. Finally, Hazel looked at him. "You followed me. You were in trouble. I told you to hold the rope. I did, while I walked." Mato met her eyes. "We're alive. That's what matters." Hazel held his gaze, then nodded slowly. She unwound the rope from her waist and handed her end to him. Their fingers brushed cold against cold, and something unspoken passed between them. Acknowledgement, respect, the deepening of trust. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you," Mato replied. They sat in silence, warming themselves. And for the first time since Mato had crashed through that door, the cabin felt less like a trap and more like a refuge. But the reprieve was short-lived. An hour later, heavy boots crunched through snow outside. A fist pounded on the door. "Mrs. Reinhardt, open up. Sheriff sent me to check on you." Hazel's face went pale. Mattow's hand moved to his revolver. Deputy David Rourke had arrived. The pounding came again harder. "Mrs. Reinhardt, I know you're in there. Open this door." Hazel stood, hands trembling slightly. Mattow rose beside her revolver, drawn but held low out of sight. Their eyes met. No choice. They had to answer. Hazel crossed to the door and pulled it open a crack. Cold air rushed in along with Deputy David Rourke, a big man thick through chest and shoulders with a grizzled beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He wore a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat crusted with ice. Snowshoes were strapped to his boots. Rourke's gaze swept the cabin and the dismantled bed, scattered papers hastily shoved into the trunk, the fire burning too hot for simple warmth. Then his eyes landed on Mattow, and his hand dropped to the revolver at his hip. "Who the hell is this?" Rourke demanded, voice hard with suspicion. Hazel stepped between them, blocking Rourke's line of sight. "A trapper. He got caught in the storm and needed shelter." Rourke's eyes narrowed. Trapper. He studied Mattow's buckskin coat, the beaded headband, the scarred forearm. "Looks Lakota to me. Half-breed." Hazel said quickly, the lie smooth. "Works the trap lines north of here. He was repairing telegraph lines when the storm hit. I couldn't leave him to freeze." Rourke didn't look convinced. He pushed past Hazel, stepping fully into the cabin. Mattow lowered his eyes, adopting the posture of deference that whites expected, shoulders hunched, gaze down. It grated, but survival meant playing roles. "What's your name?" Rourke asked. "Thomas." Mattow said, choosing a common name. "Thomas Crow." "Thomas Crow." Rourke repeated it slowly, tasting it for lies. "You got papers, trapper's license. Lost in the river last fall. Haven't had money to replace it." Rourke grunted. His gaze moved to Mattow's shoulder, where blood had seeped through the shirt. "How'd you get hurt?" "Fell on ice, tore it up on a branch." Rourke stepped closer, studying the wound. Mattow forced himself to remain still to meet the deputy's scrutiny without flinching. After a long moment, Rourke stepped back, but suspicion remained clear in his eyes. "You're lucky Mrs. Reinhardt's got a soft heart," he said. "Most folks wouldn't take in a stranger during a blizzard." "I'm grateful," Mattow said quietly. Rourke turned to Hazel. "Sheriff sent me to check on you. Roads are impassable, but I've got snowshoes and supplies. He wanted to make sure you were safe." "I'm fine, as you can see," Hazel said, voice steady despite the tension radiating from her shoulders. Rourke's gaze moved around the cabin again, lingering on the trunk where papers were hidden. "Storm's supposed to break tomorrow. Judge Cutler's train might get through by day after. Sheriff wants you to come back to town once roads clear." "I'll consider it." "That wasn't a suggestion, Mrs. Reinhardt." Rourke's voice hardened. "You're isolated out here. It's not safe." "I'm managing." Rourke's jaw tightened. He looked at Mattow again, suspicion still burning. "I'll be back tomorrow to escort you. Make sure your guest is gone by then." "Of course," Hazel said. Rourke lingered a moment longer, clearly wanting to press harder, but held back by some internal calculation. Finally, he turned and walked to the door. He paused on the threshold, looking back. "If I find out you're lying to me, Mrs. Reinhardt, there'll be consequences. For both of you." The threat was unmistakable. "I understand," Hazel said. Rourke stepped out into the storm and closed the door behind him. Hazel stood frozen, listening as his footsteps crunched away into snow. Only when the sound faded completely did she exhale, shoulders sagging. Mattow holstered his revolver. "He didn't believe you." "No," Hazel agreed. "But he didn't arrest you either." That buys us time, maybe a day. Time for what he'll be back with Klaus. Hazel turned to face him, determination hardening her features. Then we work faster. We finish organizing the evidence and get it to Judge Cutler before Klaus can stop us. Maddow pulled the documents from the trunk. Rourke knows something's wrong. He'll tell Klaus. We might not have until tomorrow. Then we don't sleep. We work through the night. Hazel knelt and pulled out her notebook. By dawn, we'll have everything ready. Maddow studied her face. Exhaustion, yes, but also resolve. He lowered himself beside her, ignoring his throbbing shoulder. All right, let's finish this. They worked through the afternoon and into evening decoding and organizing with focused intensity. Hazel decoded telegram after telegram, her fingers flying. Maddow cross-referenced deeds with his map drawing lines and circles, building a visual representation of the conspiracy. The pattern became clearer. Deliberate seizure of land surrounding coal seams near Red Oak Mine, orchestrated by Beck and enforced by Klaus. Militia payments, forged signatures, a systematic dismantling of property rights that targeted the most vulnerable. As they worked, small moments of connection deepened the bond forming between them. Hazel's hand would brush Maddow's as she passed him documents. Their shoulders would touch as they leaned over the map together. When Hazel's pencil broke, Maddow pulled out his knife and sharpened it for her, their faces close breaths mingling in the lamplight. "You're good at this," Hazel murmured as he handed back the pencil, their fingers lingering together for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Survival requires many skills," Maddow replied, his dark eyes holding hers, "including knowing when to trust unlikely allies." "Is that what we are?" Hazel asked softly. "Allies. We're becoming more than that." Maddow said, the admission surprising even himself. "At least I think we could be, if we survive." Hazel's breath caught. "When we survive," she corrected, and the certainty in her voice felt like a promise. As midnight approached, the storm finally began to ease. The wind's howl softened to a murmur, and snow fell in lighter sheets. By the time they finished organizing the evidence, the blizzard had broken, leaving the world buried but silent. Hazel set down her pencil and stretched. "We have it all. 3 decoded telegrams confirming conspiracy, 7 forged deeds, 2 witness affidavits, the receipt linking Klaus to militia raids." She looked at the organized stacks with grim satisfaction. "It's enough to bring them down." "If we can get it to Cutler," Maddow said. Hazel was about to respond when she picked up the final telegram to file it. Her face went ashen as she read the decoded text. She set down the paper with trembling hands. "What is it?" Maddow asked, alarmed. Hazel's voice was barely a whisper. "It's from Chicago, dated 6 months ago, sent to Beck." She swallowed hard. "It's about me." Maddow took the notebook and read aloud. "Package delivered. Subject married and positioned. Relay access confirmed. Monitoring progress. Recommend continued leverage via original charges. Payment upon completion. He looked up at Hazel. Her face had gone pale, eyes wide with the impact of betrayal confirmed. "AR," he said. "Albert Rosen. My former supervisor at Western Union," Hazel whispered. "The man who framed me for embezzlement." Her voice broke. "It was all planned. The frame-up driving me west, Klaus's proposal, all orchestrated. They needed someone at this relay station, someone with skills, someone they could control. So they manufactured a scandal and a marriage." Her hands clenched into fists. "I wasn't escaping to Nebraska. I was delivered here like cargo." The full horror of it settled over them. Maddow reached out and gripped her hand. "They used you, but you've been fighting back. That matters." "Does it?" Hazel's voice cracked. Every message I sent as Blind Otis, if they were monitoring me, then I led them to everyone who tried to resist. I thought I was helping, but I was just another tool in their conspiracy. Maddo squeezed her hand. Listen to me. You couldn't have known. And right now we have proof, real solid proof of everything. The framing, the conspiracy, the raids. We're going to make sure Cutler sees it all. Hazel met his eyes. Slowly determination replaced despair. You're right. We finish this. For everyone they've hurt. But before they could say more, hoofbeats shattered the silence outside, multiple horses moving fast through snow. Maddo and Hazel froze. Maddo crossed to the window and looked out. Torches bobbed in the darkness, 5 riders cutting through drifts toward the cabin. Rourke, Hazel breathed. And Klaus, Maddo added grimly, recognizing the lead rider's silhouette. They had run out of time. Back window, now, Maddo said. Hazel grabbed the satchel containing their evidence. Maddo slammed his elbow against the rear window frame. Once, twice. On the third blow, wood cracked. He yanked it open. You first, he ordered. Hazel climbed through and dropped into snow outside. Maddo shoved the satchel after her, then followed, his shoulders scraping the narrow frame. His wounded shoulders screamed, but he pushed through and tumbled into the drift beside Hazel. They were on their feet in seconds. Behind them, the front door crashed open. Klaus Reinhardt's voice cut through the night cold and commanding, "Search the cabin. Find them." Maddo grabbed Hazel's arm and pulled her toward the tree line 50 yards north. The snow was deep, slowing their progress, but darkness gave them cover. They were 20 yards from the cabin when torchlight swung in their direction. A rider shouted, "Tracks here, back window." They ran north. More hoofbeats. The riders regrouped. Klaus's voice rang out, "Fan out!" They can't have gone far. I want them alive. I have questions before I finish this. The riders split up, moving in a wide arc. Maddo and Hazel slid down an embankment toward the frozen creek. They hit the ice and ran, moving as quickly as they dared. Behind them, shouts echoed. A rifle cracked. The bullet whined past close enough that Maddo felt its heat. He shoved Hazel down, and they both hit the ice hard. Another shot. Ice exploded beside them. Maddo rolled, drew his revolver, 1 round left, and fired blind into darkness. The shot was more warning than attack. The riders pulled back briefly. It bought them seconds. Maddo hauled Hazel to her feet, and they ran again the creek, twisting through a narrow gorge with high embankments that cut sight lines. If the riders flanked them, they'd be trapped. But for now, it was cover. They ran until their legs gave out, then stumbled into a shallow hollow beneath an overhang. Maddo pressed his back against frozen mud chest, heaving. Hazel collapsed beside him, clutching the satchel. For long moments they listened. Voices had faded, but torchlight still flickered in the distance, searching. They weren't safe. Not yet. Hazel looked at Maddo, her face pale. They'll find us. It's only a matter of time. Maddo reloaded his revolver with his last bullet, 2 rounds total now. Then we don't wait. We move before they close the net. Move where we can't go to the church. They'll check there first. Maddo thought hard. Jonas Pike, the homesteader whose name is on that receipt. His place is closest, maybe a mile east. If he's as desperate as you said, he might talk. And we need his testimony about those wagons. Hazel nodded slowly. It's a long shot. We're out of short ones. They climbed out of the hollow and moved along the creek bed, staying low. The moon had risen, casting pale light across snow. It made travel easier, but also made them more visible. After 30 minutes of careful movement, they climbed out of the creek and spotted buildings in the distance. Pike's homestead. A small sod house, a barn, a corral. Smoke rose from the chimney. They approached cautiously, circling to avoid leaving direct tracks to the door. Maddo knocked 3 short raps, paused 2 more. A signal he'd learned from trappers. The door opened a crack. A gaunt face peered out. Jonas Pike, hollow-eyed, unshaven, with the look of a man standing on a cliff's edge. He saw Hazel, first recognition flickering. Then his gaze moved to Maddo, and his hand dropped to a shotgun leaning against the doorframe. "Who's he?" Pike asked, voice tight with fear. "Someone who needs your help," Hazel said quickly. "And someone who can help you in return." Pike hesitated, weighing options. Finally, he stepped back. "Get in, before someone sees you." They entered quickly. The inside was cramped and cold, with a small stove barely putting out heat. 2 children, a boy about 8 and a girl no more than 6, huddled on a pallet near the stove, wrapped in thin blankets. Pike closed and bolted the door. He looked at Hazel, then Maddo, suspicion and fear warring on his gaunt features. "What kind of trouble are you bringing to my door?" "The kind that's already here," Maddo said bluntly. He pulled the bloodied receipt from the satchel and held it out. "You sold wagons to the militia. 6 wagons, supplies, munitions. Payment from Sheriff Reinhardt." Pike's face went ashen. He took the receipt with trembling hands, staring at it like a snake. "Where did you get this?" "From the courier who shot me, right before I took it off his body." Pike sank onto a stool, receipt clutched in shaking hands. He looked up at Hazel, haunted. "I didn't know what they were for. I swear, Mrs. Reinhardt, I didn't know." "What did you think they were for?" Hazel asked quietly. "Klaus said militia needed wagons for supply runs. He paid cash up front. I was 3 months behind on my bank loan. I had 2 kids to feed, winter-coming livestock dying." Pike's voice broke. "I didn't ask questions because I couldn't afford to." "Those wagons were used in a raid." Maddo said, his voice hard. "A raid that drove my people off our land. Women and children were hurt, elders died, because of those wagons you sold." Pike's face crumpled. "I didn't know. God is my witness, I didn't know." Hazel knelt so they were eye level. "Jonas, listen. We have evidence, telegrams, deeds, affidavits. Enough to bring down Klaus and Beck. But we need more. We need your testimony that Klaus paid you for those wagons, and you saw him take delivery." Pike looked at her, then at his sleeping children. "If I testify, I'm dead. Klaus doesn't forgive. You know that, Mrs. Reinhardt. If you don't testify..." Maddo said, "More people will die. More families will lose everything. Your children will grow up in a territory ruled by thieves and killers." Pike's hands shook. He stared at the receipt, at his own signature. Finally, he looked up. "If I do this, if I testify, you swear the judge will protect me, my kids?" "I swear," Hazel said. "Judge Cutler is an honest man. He'll put you under protection." Pike closed his eyes, took a shuddering breath. "All right, I'll testify. For my kids. So they don't grow up in a world where men like Klaus run things." Relief flooded through Maddo. Another piece in place. But before he could speak, sound cut through the night, hoofbeats, distant but growing louder. Pike's eyes widened. "They're coming." Hazel moved to the window, pulled back the curtain. Torches. 4 riders moving fast toward the homestead. "Rourke," she breathed. "He guessed we'd come here." Maddo checked his revolver. 2 rounds. Not enough for a fight. He looked at Pike. "Is there another way out?" Pike hesitated, then nodded. "Root cellar. Underneath the barn. Tunnel leads out to the far side of the property." "Show us." Pike grabbed a coat and shook his children awake. The boy blinked sleepily. The girl whimpered. "Come on," Pike whispered urgently. "We have to go." Now, trust me." They moved quickly, slipping out the back door and crossing to the barn. Hoofbeats grew louder. Torchlight flickered at the property's edge. Inside the barn, Pike lifted a trap door hidden beneath hay. A ladder descended into darkness. "Down," Pike ordered. Hazel climbed first, then the children. Pike followed. Maddow brought up the rear, pulling the trapdoor shut just as riders reached the house. They huddled in the tunnel, narrow, cold, smelling of damp earth. Above, heavy boots thudded across the barn floor. Voices shouted commands. Maddow pressed a finger to his lips, signaling silence. They waited, barely breathing, as the search continued overhead. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded. Voices faded. Pike led them through the tunnel, crawling on hands and knees, until they emerged in a thicket of brush 100 yards from the homestead. They stood in the cold night, gasping. The torches were still visible at Pike's house riders searching. But they had bought time. Not much, but enough. "We need to keep moving," Maddow said. "Head for the church. Gather anyone who will listen. By the time Cutler's train arrives, we'll have a crowd of witnesses." Hazel nodded. But before they could move a sound, froze them a rifle being cocked, unmistakable and close. Deputy Rourke stepped out from behind a tree rifle leveled at Maddow's chest. Nobody moves. Maddow's hand inched toward his revolver. Rourke saw the movement and shook his head. "Don't. I'll drop you before you clear leather." Hazel stepped forward, placing herself between Maddow and the rifle. Her voice was steady despite the fear Maddow could see in her rigid shoulders. "David, listen to me. Klaus is lying to you. He's been lying to all of us. We have proof." Rourke's face was hard, but something flickered in his eyes, doubt maybe, or the ghost of conscience. "I've got orders, Mrs. Reinhardt. I bring you in, or I don't come back. Sheriff made that very clear. Orders from a man who orchestrated raids that killed innocent people, who stole land, who murdered." Hazel's voice strengthened. "You've always been a decent man, David. I've seen it. Don't let Klaus turn you into something you're not. Don't let him make you complicit in this." Rourke's rifle wavered. He looked at Pike, at the frightened children clinging to their father's coat at Maddow, then back at Hazel. "You really have proof. More than enough to hang him," Hazel said. "And everyone who helped him." Rourke was silent, internal war visible on his face. Finally, slowly, he lowered the rifle. "You've got until the judge's train arrives. After that, I can't protect you. Klaus will come for you himself." Relief flooded through Maddow, but he kept his expression neutral. "Why help us?" Rourke met his gaze, jaw tight. "Because I've got a sister, 12 years old, and she doesn't deserve to grow up in a place where men like Klaus Reinhardt run things. Where doing the right thing gets you killed." He looked at Hazel. "Get to the church. I'll buy you time by telling Klaus you headed west toward the rail line. But after that, you're on your own. I can't risk more without exposing myself, and then I'm no good to anyone." Hazel nodded. "Thank you, David. This takes courage. Just don't make me regret it." Rourke turned and walked back toward the homestead, disappearing into the night. Maddow, Hazel, Pike, and his children moved in the opposite direction toward the church and whatever fragile hope remained. The night was clear now, stars brilliant overhead. The storm finally passed. But Maddow knew the real storm was just beginning. The church stood at Red Oak's eastern edge, a simple whitewashed structure with a small bell tower and a graveyard out back where wooden crosses marked the graves of those who'd lost their fight with the frontier. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the windows. As they approached, the door opened, and a woman stepped out, Eliza Hart, the schoolteacher in her 40s with graying hair, pinned severely and eyes that softened when she saw Hazel. "Mrs. Reinhardt," Eliza said, hurrying forward. "Thank the heavens. We heard Ryder's gunshots. I feared the worst." Hazel embraced her briefly. "We're alive. That's something." Eliza's gaze moved to Maddow, taking in his bloodied shirt and wary stance, then to Pike and his children. "Come inside, all of you, quickly." They filed into the church. Inside, a dozen people huddled near a cast-iron stove, mostly women and children, but also a few older men. Dr. Marcus Whitlow was there tending to a child with a cough. He looked up as they entered, his eyes sharpening when he saw Maddow's wound. "You're hurt," Whitlow said, rising. "I'm fine," Maddow replied automatically. "You're bleeding through your shirt. Sit." The doctor's tone brooked no argument. Maddow sat on a pew while Whitlow examined his shoulder. Several stitches had torn during their escape, and the wound had reopened partially. Whitlow worked quickly, cleaning and restitching with steady hands and the efficient movements of long practice. While he worked, Hazel addressed the room, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet space. "Listen to me. Sheriff Reinhardt and Silas Beck have been stealing land for years, forcing families off property, falsifying deeds, using violence and intimidation. We have proof-coded telegrams, forged documents, witness statements. Judge Cutler's train is due tomorrow, maybe the day after. We need to present this evidence before Klaus can destroy it." Murmurs rippled through the room. An older man with a scarred face and missing fingers spoke up, his voice rough. "You're asking us to go against the sheriff. That's a death sentence. Klaus doesn't leave enemies alive." "It's a death sentence to stay silent," Hazel countered. "How many of you have lost land, lost loved ones? How many have watched Klaus and Beck grow richer while you scrape by on nothing?" She looked around the room, meeting eyes. "This is our chance to fight back. But we need witnesses. People willing to testify to what they've seen, what they've experienced." Silence stretched. People exchanged glances, fear and anger mingling on their faces. The weight of the decision pressed down. Then Jonas Pike stood, his children still clinging to him. His voice was quiet but steady. "She's right. I sold wagons to Klaus. I didn't know they'd be used for raids, but that doesn't change what happened. People got hurt because I was desperate and didn't ask questions." He looked at his children, then back at the room. "I'm testifying. For my kids. So they don't grow up in a world where men like Klaus Reinhardt get away with this." Dr. Whitlow tied off the last stitch on Maddow's shoulder and straightened. "I witnessed the raid in '79. I treated the wounded, broken bones, lacerations, concussions from being beaten and roughly handled. I documented everything in my medical log." He looked at Maddow. "I'll testify too." Eliza Hart stepped forward. "The children sheltering here have families who've lost everything to foreclosures and forced sales. I'll speak for them and their parents." One by one, others stood. A homesteader whose claim had been stolen through forged papers. A widow whose husband had disappeared after challenging Beck's fencing of public water access. A blacksmith who'd refused to shoe horses for militia raids and been beaten severely as a warning. Slowly, painfully, a coalition formed, fragile, frightened, but determined. Hazel felt something loosen in her chest. Hope, tentative and fragile, but real. Maddow stood testing his shoulder. It hurt, but Whitlow's stitches held. He looked at the gathered crowd and felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years, and the possibility of justice actually being served. But that possibility shattered less than an hour later when Rourke burst through the church door, his face pale and tight with fear. "They're coming," he said, breathing hard. "Klaus Beck and at least a dozen armed men. They know you're here. You've got maybe 5 minutes before they surround this place." Panic erupted. People scrambled, grabbing children and belongings. Hazel grabbed Rourke's arm. "How much time?" "5 minutes. Maybe less. They're on horseback, moving fast." Maddow looked at Hazel. "We can't fight them here. Too many civilians. Too many children." "Then we run," Hazel said. "Draw them away from the church." "Run where?" Maddow asked, though he already knew. "The mine. Red Oak Mine, a mile south. We can lose them in the tunnel's hide until the judge arrives." It was desperate, possibly suicidal, but desperation was all they had left. Maddow turned to the crowd. "Stay here. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone except the judge. Barricade if you have to." Eliza stepped forward. "What about you?" "We'll lead them away," Hazel said. She handed the satchel to Eliza, and the older woman's hands closed around it firmly. "Keep the evidence safe. If we don't make it back, give it to Judge Cutler. Make absolutely sure it reaches him. Everything depends on it." Eliza took the satchel, her expression solemn. "We will. I swear it." Hazel, Maddow, Pike, and Rourke slipped out the back door into the pre-dawn darkness. The sky was lightening to the east, turning the world from black to gray. They ran toward the mine breath, misting in cold air. Behind them, hoofbeats thundered and men shouted. They reached the mine entrance just as riders crested the hill. Maddow fired his last 2 shots, forcing the riders to scatter, and by precious seconds, then they plunged into the mine, swallowed by darkness. The tunnel was narrow, and pitch-black air, thick with coal dust and the smell of damp rock. They stumbled forward, hands on walls, moving by touch and desperate hope. Behind them, torchlight flickered as riders entered the mine. "This way," Pike hissed, leading them down a side passage. The tunnel sloped downward, ceiling lowering until they had to crouch. Water dripped from above, and timbers creaked ominously, the sound of old wood under too much weight for too long. A shout echoed from behind. "I see them this way." They ran harder, lungs burning. The tunnel branched. Pike chose left without hesitation, squeezing through a narrow gap. They emerged into a larger chamber, littered with old mining equipment, rusted picks, broken carts, frayed rope. Rourke grabbed a timber support and kicked it hard. The wood splintered with a sharp crack. "We can collapse the tunnel, slow them down." "Do it," Maddow said. Rourke and Pike kicked at the supports, while Maddow and Hazel watched the entrance, listening as torchlight grew brighter and voices louder. Timber groaned. Then, with a sound like thunder, the ceiling gave way. Rock and dirt cascaded down, filling the passage. Dust exploded, choking and blinding. When the dust settled, the tunnel behind them was completely blocked. But they were trapped in the chamber with only one other exit, a narrow adit leading deeper into the mine, into older workings that hadn't been used in years. "We have to keep moving," Hazel said, coughing. They stumbled through the adit, emerging into another tunnel. This one was older, timber rotting air stale and thick. Maddow's instincts screamed danger, but there was no choice. They pressed forward. That's when they smelled it, smoke acrid and growing thicker. Pike's eyes widened in horror. Fire. Someone set a fire in the mine. Smoke grew denser, billowing through tunnels. Flames licked at old timbers, feeding on coal dust and dry wood. Heat rolled toward them in waves that grew more intense with each passing second. "We have to go back," Rourke said, voice tight with fear. "Can't," Maddow replied. "Tunnels blocked completely." "Then forward. Find another way out." They ran, fire chasing them, smoke clawing at lungs. Hazel pulled her scarf over her mouth, tears streaming from the acrid sting. Maddow grabbed her arm, guiding her forward through the thickening haze. The tunnel twisted, narrowed, then opened into a vertical shaft. Maddow looked up. Daylight, faint but real, filtered down from above. A ladder clung to the shaft wall, rusted but still attached. "Climb," he ordered. Hazel went first, then Pike, then Rourke. Matto brought up the rear, the heat at his back, intensifying smoke, choking. He climbed hands, slipping on rusted rungs that flaked orange beneath his grip, until he pulled himself out onto the surface. Just as flames roared up the shaft behind him, they collapsed in the snow, gasping and coughing lungs desperate for clean air. The sky above was pale blue, the storm completely gone, the world silent except for their ragged breathing. But there was no time to rest, because Klaus Reinhardt stood 20 feet away, rifle aimed directly at Hazel's head. Around him, a dozen armed men fanned out in a semicircle, trapping them. And beside Klaus, mounted on a fine horse, sat Silas Beck, heavy-set, expensively dressed, watching with cold calculation. "Stand up," Klaus said, his voice controlled and deadly. Slowly. Hazel pushed herself to her feet, swaying from exhaustion and smoke inhalation. Matto rose beside her, hands raised and empty. Pike and Rourke stayed down, too spent to move. Around them, Beck's hired guns closed in rifles and revolvers drawn, faces hard and pitiless. Klaus stepped forward, his sheriff's star glinting in the morning light and the broken clasp clearly visible. The badge suspended from rawhide, exactly as witnesses had described. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty etched into every line. His pale blue eyes assessed Hazel like a merchant evaluating damaged goods. "You disappoint me, wife." Klaus said, his tone almost conversational. "You were supposed to operate the relay station, copy dispatches, keep your head down like a good little woman. Instead, you played blind Otis, fed information to rabble and savages. Thought you were clever." Hazel met his gaze without flinching, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I was clever enough to fool you for 6 months." Klaus's smile widened fractionally, though it never touched his cold eyes. "You fooled no one." He gestured to Beck, who sat calmly on his horse. "We've been watching you since the beginning. Every message you sent we knew about. Every contact you made we tracked. You didn't stop us, Hazel. You helped us identify everyone who opposed us. Made our job considerably easier, really. Should thank you for that." The words hit like physical blows. Hazel's breath caught, face going pale. Beside her, Matto stepped fractionally closer, a silent show of support and solidarity. Klaus continued, clearly savoring her pain, like fine whiskey. "The embezzlement charge in Chicago. That was Beck's brilliant idea. We needed someone at the relay station, someone with cipher skills, someone we could control through fear and desperation. So we framed you, drove you west like cattle to slaughter, and I played the savior." His smile turned crueler. "You walked right into it, grateful for my protection. Pathetically, desperately grateful. It was almost touching." Hazel's hands clenched into fists, rage and humiliation warring with fear. "You're a monster." "I'm a businessman," Klaus corrected smoothly. "And you're a loose end that needs tying off. Can't have witnesses running around with evidence, now can we?" He raised the rifle sighting down the barrel at Hazel's chest. Time seemed to slow. Matto's muscles coiled, preparing to move. Even though he knew it was hopeless, he had no weapon, no advantage, nothing but the desperate need to act. But before Klaus could fire, before Matto could throw himself between Hazel and the bullet, Rourke spoke up from where he knelt in the snow. "Sheriff," Rourke called out, his voice carrying clearly. "Sir, if I might make a suggestion." Klaus paused, rifle still raised, but finger relaxing slightly on the trigger. He looked at his deputy with irritation. "What is it, Rourke? I'm busy here." Rourke climbed slowly to his feet, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Just thinking, sir. if you shoot Mrs. Reinhardt here in front of witnesses." He gestured vaguely at Pike. "It's murder, plain and simple. Even with your authority, that's going to raise questions when the judge arrives." Beck leaned forward in his saddle, interested now. "The deputy makes a point, Klaus. We need this clean. Accidental deaths, mine collapse, tragic but explainable." Klaus lowered the rifle fractionally, considering. "You suggesting we take them back into the mine? Or we could stage it different," Rourke said, moving slowly closer to Klaus, his posture deferential and non-threatening. "Make it look like they attacked you and you defended yourself. Self-defense is legal even for a sheriff shooting his own wife if she's turned criminal." He was within 10 feet now, still talking, still moving, with careful casualness. "Just need to make sure the story's straight before we—" He lunged. Rourke covered the remaining distance in 2 fast strides and grabbed Klaus's rifle barrel, wrenching it upward. The gun fired, the shot going wild into the sky. Men shouted. Klaus swore and drove his elbow into Rourke's face, but the deputy held on grimly. In that instant of chaos, Matto moved. He dove not for Klaus. Rourke had that covered, but for the nearest gunman, a lean man with a rifle. Matto hit him low, driving his shoulder into the man's knees. They went down together. The rifle clattered on frozen ground. Matto grabbed it, rolled, came up firing. The shot caught one of Beck's men in the shoulder, spinning him around. Another gunman swung his weapon toward Matto. Hazel, seeing the danger, grabbed the nearest object, a fist-sized rock, and hurled it with all her strength. It caught the gunman in the temple with a sickening crack. He dropped like a cut string. Pike, seeing the sudden reversal, scrambled to his feet and dove for a dropped pistol near one of the fallen men. His hands closed around the grip just as another gunman turned toward him. Pike fired wildly. The shot went high, but it forced the gunman to duck, buying precious seconds. Meanwhile, Rourke and Klaus were locked in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Klaus was bigger and stronger, but Rourke fought with desperate conviction. They grappled for the rifle, stumbling back and forth in the snow. Klaus got a hand free and punched Rourke in the face once, twice. Blood sprayed. Rourke's grip weakened. Klaus tore the rifle free and swung the stock like a club. It caught Rourke across the jaw, and the deputy went down hard. Klaus raised the rifle, preparing to finish him. Matto saw it happening, saw Rourke defenseless, saw Klaus about to shoot. Without hesitation, Matto fired the rifle he'd taken. The shot was rushed, not aimed, but it hit Klaus in the thigh. The sheriff screamed and went down, clutching his leg as blood poured between his fingers. Son of a... Klaus's curse was cut off as Rourke, somehow still conscious, despite the brutal blow, kicked the rifle from Klaus's hands and drove his fist into the sheriff's face. Once. Twice. Klaus's head snapped back and he collapsed, semi-conscious and bleeding. But the situation was far from resolved. Beck's remaining men, still 8 or 9 of them, were recovering from their shock and bringing weapons to bear. They started firing. Bullets whined through the air. Matto dove behind a snowdrift, pulling Hazel down beside him. Pike scrambled for cover behind an old mining cart. "We're pinned down," Hazel shouted over the gunfire. "They'll kill us all." Rourke, blood streaming from his nose and mouth, crawled to cover beside Matto. "Not if we can get to Beck," he gasped. "He's the one paying them. Take him out, maybe they'll run." Matto looked across the killing ground. Beck sat on his horse 30 yards away, seemingly unconcerned by the violence surrounding him. But Matto could see calculation in the man's eyes. Beck was weighing odds, deciding whether to stay or flee. "Cover me," Matto said. Before anyone could argue, he was moving. He zigzagged across the open ground, using every bit of cover: rocks, old equipment, snowdrifts. Bullets kicked up snow around him. One grazed his arm, tearing cloth and skin. He kept moving. Beck saw him coming and yanked his horse's reins, trying to wheel away, but the horse, spooked by gunfire, reared instead. Beck fought for control. Maddow covered the last 10 yards in a sprint and leaped, grabbing Beck's coat and hauling him from the saddle. They hit the ground hard. The horse bolted. Beck, heavier and softer than Maddow, tried to draw a pistol from his coat. Maddow grabbed his wrist and slammed it against the ground. Once, twice. The pistol fell free. Beck headbutted Maddow, catching him on the already injured shoulder. Pain exploded white-hot. Maddow's grip loosened. Beck shoved him off and scrambled for the fallen pistol. A gunshot cracked, not from Beck's gun, but from somewhere else. Beck jerked, eyes going wide with shock. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his expensive coat, right over his heart. Then he toppled sideways into the snow, dead, before he hit the ground. Maddow looked up, stunned, and saw Hazel standing 20 feet away, Klaus's rifle in her hands, smoke still rising from the barrel. Her face was pale but set with determination. Their eyes met across the bloody snow. "He was going to shoot you," she said simply. Around them, the remaining gunmen had frozen, shocked by their employer's sudden death. In that moment of hesitation, Rourke staggered to his feet, blood streaming down his face, and shouted with all the authority he could muster. "Beck's dead, Klaus is down. You're all working for ghosts now." He pointed at the nearest gunman. "You want to die for men who can't pay you anymore, or do you want to ride away while you still can?" The gunmen looked at each other, looked at Beck's body, at Klaus bleeding in the snow, at their dead comrades. The math was simple and brutal. They were hired guns, not loyal soldiers. With Beck dead and Klaus wounded, there was no payday, no protection, no reason to die here. One by one, they lowered their weapons and backed toward their horses. Within moments, they were mounting up and riding hard to the west, leaving their employers behind. Silence fell across the bloody scene. Maddow pushed himself to his feet, breathing hard, blood running down his arm from the graze. Hazel lowered the rifle with shaking hands. Pike emerged from behind the mining cart, still clutching the pistol, but looking dazed. Rourke stood over Klaus, who was conscious, but clearly in agony from the leg wound. "It's over," Hazel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's actually over." As if in answer, a sound cut through the morning air, sharp and unmistakable. A train whistle, long and loud, echoing across the prairie. They all turned. From the east, along the tracks that ran past Red Oak, a rotary snowplow locomotive appeared, steam billowing from its stack whistle, screaming. Behind it, a passenger car and a flat car loaded with soldiers in state militia uniforms, real soldiers, not hired guns. The locomotive ground to a halt 50 yards from the mine entrance, massive and imposing. Soldiers jumped down, rifles at ready, moving with military precision. A tall man in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat stepped off the passenger car's silver-haired, weathered face, eyes that had seen too much and judged accordingly. Judge Abner Cutler. He surveyed the scene with a single sweeping glance, the bodies in the snow, the blood, the wounded men, the smoking mine entrance. His face hardened into something carved from granite. "Well," he said, his voice carrying natural authority. "This is quite the welcoming committee. Someone want to explain what in blazes happened here?" Hazel stepped forward, still holding the rifle. "Your Honor, I'm Hazel Reinhardt. Sheriff Klaus Reinhardt and Silas Beck attempted to murder us to prevent evidence of land fraud and conspiracy from reaching you. We were forced to defend ourselves." She gestured to the mine. "They set fire to trap us. They tried to shoot us when we escaped. Deputy Rourke turned against them and helped us fight back." Cutler's gaze moved to Klaus, bleeding in the snow, and then to Beck's body, then to Rourke's battered face. "And Beck, I shot him." Hazel said clearly. He was about to kill Maddo, this man here who brought the evidence from the Lakota territory. It was him or us. Cutler studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Self-defense by the look of it. We'll sort it all out properly. He gestured to his soldiers. Secure these men. Get the wounded medical attention, even the sheriff, much as he might not deserve it. I want statements from everyone. Soldiers moved efficiently, disarming Klaus and binding his wound to prevent him bleeding out before trial. Rourke was helped to sit, his face swelling badly, but his eyes clear. Pike gathered his children who had hidden during the gunfight, but now emerged from the church, brought by Eliza, who'd heard the shots. Maddo walked to Hazel. She was still holding the rifle, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Gently he took it from her and set it aside. Then without words, he pulled her into an embrace. She came willingly, pressing her face against his chest, her whole body trembling. He held her carefully, mindful of his wounds, and felt her tears soak through his shirt. They stood like that for a long moment while soldiers moved around them, and Judge Cutler began taking control of the scene. You saved my life, Maddo said quietly into her hair. You saved mine first. Hazel replied, her voice muffled. Multiple times. I was just returning the favor. We saved each other, Maddo corrected. That's what partners do. Hazel pulled back just enough to look up at his face. Partners. If you'll have me, Maddo said. For however long you want. No pressure, no expectations, just partnership. Facing whatever comes next together. Hazel's lips trembled into something that might have been a smile. I think I'd like that very much. Judge Cutler approached them, his expression still grave. Mrs. Reinhardt, I'll need you to retrieve that evidence you mentioned. And I'll need detailed statements from you from this gentleman. He gestured to Maddo and from Deputy Rourke about everything that's transpired. The evidence is at the church, Hazel said, straightening and wiping her eyes. Eliza Hart has it, and we have witnesses ready to testify, Dr. Whitlow, Jonas Pike, and others. Good. We'll convene a formal hearing immediately. Cutler looked at Klaus, now being loaded into a wagon by soldiers. Sheriff Reinhardt will face territorial justice, as will anyone else involved in this conspiracy. Over the next several hours, the scene transformed from battlefield to courthouse. Cutler set up operations in the church, which was large enough to hold everyone. Soldiers brought Klaus in on a stretcher. He'd live, though he'd walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Beck's body was covered and set aside for burial. The formal hearing began in the afternoon. Judge Cutler presided with stern efficiency, hearing testimony from witness after witness. Dr. Whitlow described the raid, showed his medical logs documenting injuries. Jonas Pike confirmed the wagon sale produced. His receipt testified to Klaus's specific instructions. Hazel decoded telegrams on the spot, demonstrating the cipher methods and explaining how the conspiracy had been orchestrated. Maddo testified, last speaking with quiet dignity about the forced relocation and the deaths on reservation land and the 2 years he'd spent gathering evidence. He presented his wife's letter, read it aloud in a voice that only cracked once, and explained how her dying wish for justice, rather than revenge, had guided his entire quest. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. Judge Cutler stood, his face grave. I've heard enough. Klaus Reinhardt, you are hereby charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, theft accessory to manslaughter, corruption of public office, and attempted murder. You will be transported to the state capitol at Lincoln for trial, where I have no doubt you will be convicted and sentenced to the fullest extent of the law. He looked around the room. Silas Beck's death, while tragic in the sense that any death is tragic, appears to have been justified self-defense. No charges will be filed against Mrs. Reinhardt for that action. Klaus, pale and in obvious pain, glared at Hazel with pure hatred. "You'll regret this. Someone will—" "Silence," Cutler snapped. "You're in no position to threaten anyone. One more word and I'll add contempt of court to your charges." He turned to Hazel. "Mrs. Reinhardt, regarding the charges against you in Chicago, I'll personally wire the Illinois governor and the Illinois authorities. Based on the evidence presented here, particularly the telegram proving Albert Rosen framed you on Beck's orders, I'm confident those charges will be dismissed and your name fully cleared." Hazel nodded, throat too tight to speak. Cutler continued. "Deputy Rourke, your actions today were courageous and just. You turned against corruption at great personal risk. I'm recommending you for commendation and suggesting the town hold proper elections for a new sheriff. I believe you'd make an excellent candidate." Rourke, his face bandaged, managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Your Honor. I was just doing what my conscience demanded." As the hearing concluded and soldiers prepared to transport Klaus to the state capitol at Lincoln, the gathered townspeople began to disperse. But the mood was different now, no longer fearful, but hopeful. Cautiously, tentatively hopeful. Eliza approached Hazel and Maddow. "Jonas Pike," she said quietly. "During the gunfight, he was hit. We didn't realize how badly until afterward. Dr. Whitlow tried, but..." Hazel's heart sank. "Where is he?" They found Jonas Pike lying on a pallet near the church altar, his children beside him. Dr. Whitlow knelt nearby, his expression somber. Pike was pale, breathing shallow, a bandage over his abdomen dark with blood. Hazel rushed to his side, taking his hand. "Jonas, hold on. The judge heard your testimony. You did it. You stopped them." Pike's eyes fluttered open. He managed a weak smile. "Did we win?" "Yes," Hazel said fiercely, tears streaming. "Yes, Jonas. Klaus is going to prison. Beck is dead. Your testimony helped bring them down. You were so brave." Pike looked at his children, his eyes filling with love and regret. "My babies. Tell them their papa wasn't a coward. That in the end, I did what was right." "You weren't a coward," Maddow said, kneeling on Pike's other side. "You were a man who made a mistake and then risked everything to fix it. That's the definition of courage. Your children will grow up knowing their father was a hero." Pike's grip on Hazel's hand weakened. "Take care of them. Please, don't let them end up like me, desperate and alone." "I'll take them," Eliza said firmly, tears running down her weathered face. "They'll have a home, an education, love. I swear it, Jonas." Pike smiled, peace settling over his features. "That's good. That's real good." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Saw what needed doing. Did it." He took one more shallow breath, looked at his children with infinite tenderness, and then his eyes went still. His hand went slack in Hazel's grip. The little girl burst into sobs. The boy sat rigid, too shocked to cry. Eliza gathered them both into her arms, holding them tight while they grieved. Hazel stood slowly, grief and rage and exhaustion warring inside her. Maddow was there immediately, his presence solid and steady. He didn't speak, just stood with her in silent witness to a good man's sacrifice. The next 3 days passed in a blur. The town worked to recover from the storm's aftermath and the violence. Klaus was transported under heavy guard to the state capitol at Lincoln. Formal charges were filed. Beck's assets were frozen pending resolution of claims from families he'd defrauded. Dr. Whitlow worked tirelessly, treating injuries from the gunfight. Rourke recovered slowly, his face bruised but healing. He accepted the role of acting sheriff and began organizing proper elections. Maddow spent those days helping where he could, clearing snow, repairing storm damage, chopping wood for families who'd lost their supplies. His shoulder ached, and the graze on his arm throbbed, but Whitlow's stitches held. Men who had feared him days ago now worked alongside him, and slowly grudging respect grew into something like acceptance. Hazel remained at the telegraph station, her fingers flying across the keys as she sent official reports, exoneration requests, and messages to families across the territory, informing them of Beck and Klaus's downfall. She worked long hours, barely sleeping, as if she could outrun her guilt over Pike's death through sheer activity. On the third evening, Maddo found her there, slumped over the telegraph key, exhausted. He touched her shoulder gently. "You need rest. I need to finish these dispatches. There are so many families who will still be there tomorrow," Maddo said firmly. "Come on. You're no good to anyone if you collapse." Hazel let him lead her outside. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. The air was still and cold, but no longer brutal. They walked to the edge of town in comfortable silence. Finally, Hazel spoke. "I keep thinking about Jonas. If we'd just gotten to the church 5 minutes earlier. If I'd shot Beck before he—" "Don't," Maddo interrupted gently. "Don't do that to yourself. Pike made his own choices. He chose to help us knowing the risks. He chose to testify. He chose to fight. And because of those choices, his children will grow up in a world where men like Klaus don't have absolute power. That matters. That's what he wanted." "It still hurts," Hazel whispered. "It should hurt," Maddo said. "If it didn't, we'd be no better than the men we fought. The pain means we're still human, still capable of caring." He paused, then added quietly, "I've carried that pain for 2 years, the pain of losing Ayana and Kimimela. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes something you can live with, something that reminds you why fighting for justice matters." Hazel looked at him, seeing the grief he still carried etched in the lines around his eyes. "Does it get easier?" "No," Maddo said honestly. "But you get stronger, and having someone to share the weight helps." He held her gaze. "I'm here, Hazel, for as long as you want me to be." Hazel felt tears prick her eyes again. How many had she cried these past days? But they were different tears now. Not just grief, but also relief and gratitude, and something that might have been hope. "I want you here. I really do." They stood together, watching the sun set, and when Hazel shivered from cold, Maddo wrapped his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into his warmth, and they stayed like that, until stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Over the following days, official word came from Chicago, all charges against Hazel dismissed, full pardon issued, her reputation restored. Albert Rosen had been arrested based on evidence Judge Cutler provided. The conspiracy was unraveling across state lines. Klaus's trial was set for the spring. Witnesses would be called to the state capitol at Lincoln, but Judge Cutler assured them the evidence was overwhelming. Conviction was certain. Rourke was formally elected sheriff in a special town election, winning by a landslide. His first act was to organize a town council to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. Dr. Whitlow established a medical fund for families affected by Beck and Klaus's schemes, using money seized from Beck's accounts. It wasn't full restitution, but it was a start. And slowly, carefully, Red Oak began to heal. 1 week after the confrontation at the mine, Maddo and Hazel stood at Jonas Pike's grave in the church cemetery. The headstone was simple but dignified, paid for by community collection. Jonas Pike, loving father, he did what was right. Eliza had brought Pike's children to visit earlier. They had placed wildflowers dried from summer, carefully preserved at the base of the stone. Now they were back at the church, learning their letters and beginning to heal. He should have lived to see his children grow, Hazel said quietly. Yes, Maddo agreed. But because he made the choice he did, they'll grow up free. That has to mean something. They stood in silence for a moment, then turned and walked back toward town. As they reached the church, Hazel paused. "What will you do now?" "Stay here. Go back to your people." Maddow considered the question. "There's not much to go back to. The reservation is still harsh. My people are still scattered. I've been thinking." He trailed off and then started again. "I've been thinking maybe I could do more good here. Help families who were displaced. Make sure the land restoration proceeds fairly. Be a bridge between the tribal communities and the settlers." Hope lit in Hazel's eyes. "You'd stay in Red Oak?" "If there's a reason to," Maddow said, looking at her meaningfully. "Is there?" Hazel's breath caught. "I think there might be. I've been offered the position of official territorial telegraph operator, honest work, decent pay, no one controlling me through fear." She hesitated, then continued. "And I've been thinking that Red Oak, for all its roughness, is a place where I could actually build a life. A real life. Not running from something, but running toward something." "Running toward what?" Maddow asked softly. "A future. Justice. Community." Hazel met his eyes. "Maybe even happiness. With someone who understands what I've been through. Who I can trust absolutely. Who makes me feel like survival isn't the only goal, like there might be something worth living for beyond just staying alive." Maddow reached into his pocket and pulled out the rope they had used during the blizzard, the clothesline that had kept them tethered when the world was white chaos. He had carried it since that first desperate night, a reminder of how they'd survived. He drew his knife and cut the rope cleanly in half. He handed one piece to Hazel, their fingers lingering together in the exchange warmth against warmth despite the cold. "For the next bad wind," he said quietly. "Because there will be more storms, more challenges, more fights worth fighting. But we don't have to face them alone anymore." Hazel looked at the rope in her hand, feeling its texture, its weight, its significance. Then she looked up at Maddow and everything she felt. Gratitude, trust, affection, hope, the beginnings of something that might grow into love. Given time was clear in her eyes. "For the next bad wind," she repeated. Then, with careful deliberation, she stepped closer and reached up to touch his face, her palm warm against his weathered skin. Maddow covered her hand with his, holding it there, and slowly leaned down. Their foreheads touched, an intimate gesture, but not presumptuous, a promise of closeness, without demands. They stood like that for several breaths, anchoring each other. Then Hazel tilted her head up slightly, and Maddow, reading the invitation in her eyes, kissed her. It was gentle, careful, respectful, the kiss of two people who had been broken and were learning to trust again, who understood that real intimacy was earned through shared hardship, not declared through grand gestures. When they pulled apart, both were breathing slightly faster, but their eyes held certainty. This was right. This was real. This was earned. "We should go back," Hazel said softly. "Eliza's expecting us for supper." "In a moment," Maddow said. He was memorizing this, the way sunset light caught in her hair, the soft curve of her smile, the hope in her eyes that mirrored his own. Then, still holding hands, rope pieces tucked safely in their pockets, they walked back toward the church together. Back toward the community they had fought to protect. Back toward the beginning of whatever future they would build, one day at a time, one choice at a time. The path ahead wasn't certain. There would be challenges, Klaus's trial, the slow process of land restoration, the work of rebuilding trust between communities that had been set against each other by corrupt men. But for the first time in years, both Maddow and Hazel felt something that had been missing for so long. Hope, Not the desperate, fragile hope of people on the edge of death, but the steady, earned hope of people who had faced darkness and chosen to fight for light, who had survived not just by luck, but by courage, by choosing to trust when trust seemed impossible, by refusing to let cruelty and corruption have the final word. As they entered the church, warmth and light welcomed them. Eliza had organized a community supper, simple food shared among people who had been through hell together and come out the other side. Pike's children were there, laughing tentatively at something Dr. Whitlow was saying. Rourke sat with his young sister, the fear finally gone from both their faces. Homesteaders and townspeople mixed together, finding common ground in survival and hope for better days. Maddow and Hazel joined the circle, accepting bowls of stew with gratitude. They sat side by side, shoulders touching in easy comfort, rope pieces in their pockets, a tangible reminder of what they'd survived and what they'd built. Later, as the evening wound down, Eliza raised her cup. To Jonas Pike, who found courage when it mattered, to everyone who testified despite their fears, to Deputy Rourke, who chose conscience over orders, and to unexpected allies. She looked directly at Maddow and Hazel, who proved that justice is worth fighting for, even when victory seems impossible. To justice, the room echoed, raising cups and mugs. To second chances, Hazel added quietly, looking at Maddow. To new beginnings, Maddow replied, his eyes holding hers. They drank together, the simple act, feeling like a covenant. Around them, the community that had been broken by corruption began the slow, painful work of healing. There would be setbacks. There would be struggles. But for the first time, the people of Red Oak had reason to believe that their voices mattered, that standing up to injustice could succeed, that the future might actually be better than the past. As people began departing to their homes, Maddow and Hazel lingered. They helped Eliza clean up, working in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the natural coordination of people learning each other's rhythms. When the work was done and the church was quiet, they stepped outside into the cold night. Stars blazed overhead in impossible profusion, and the Milky Way a river of light across the black sky. The world felt clean and new, as if the storm and the violence had washed away something corrupt and left space for growth. "It's beautiful," Hazel said softly, looking up at the stars. "It is," Maddow agreed, but he was looking at her, not the sky. Hazel turned and caught him looking. She didn't blush or look away. Instead, she smiled, a real smile, unguarded and genuine. "What are you thinking?" "That I'm grateful," Maddow said honestly. "For the storm that brought me to your door. For the trust we built when trust seemed impossible. For every moment that led us here." He paused. "And I'm thinking that Ayanna was right. That honoring the dead means living well, building something good from the pain. That justice matters, but so does what comes after." Hazel stepped closer, and this time, when Maddow wrapped his arms around her, the embrace was natural, comfortable, full of promise. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling safe in a way she hadn't felt in years. "Stay with me tonight," she said quietly. Not for anything improper. Just stay. I don't want to be alone. I don't want you to be alone." "All right," Maddow agreed. "We'll stay together. Keep the fires burning. Watch for the next storm, side by side." They walked to the telegraph station where Hazel had been staying. It was a small room, barely furnished, but it was warm and clean and safe. They sat together by the small stove, not speaking much, just existing in each other's presence. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both, and they dozed there. Hazel leaning against Maddow's shoulder, his arm around her, both of them holding their rope pieces like talismans. When dawn came, painting the world in shades of gold and pink, they woke together. The new day felt full of possibility. "Good morning," Hazel said softly. "Good morning," Maddo replied. They didn't move apart immediately. Instead, they sat there watching the sunrise through the window, two people who had survived the worst and were beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, they deserved the best. The fight for justice wasn't over. Klaus's trial would require their testimony. Land restoration would take months, maybe years. Healing, both personal and communal, was a long process with no guaranteed outcome. But they would face it together, with rope pieces in their pockets to remind them that they'd survived one storm and could survive the next. With the memory of good people like Jonas Pike, who had chosen courage over fear. With the knowledge that sometimes the darkest nights led to the brightest dawns. As the sun rose fully over Red Oak, Nebraska, on that February morning in 1881, Maddo and Hazel stood and faced it together. They had been strangers days ago. They had been enemies by marriage. They had become allies through necessity and partners through choice. And now, standing in the light of a new day, they were beginning to become something more. Something that would take time to define and longer to fully build. But for the first time in years, neither of them was afraid of the future. They had faced death and darkness and corruption. They had survived. And survival, Maddo's wife had once told him, was its own kind of victory. But this feeling of hope, of connection, of possibility, this was something more than mere survival. This was the beginning of learning to live again.